Hi everyone, we're going to be talking about user mappings. Let's start off with the basics. Why do we have user mappings? Why are user mappings even needed? When you're migrating any type of content from a source to a target SharePoint, many things change between those two environments and they depend on so many things. What account are you using to connect to your source versus your target? Are your source users using, as an example, NTLM authentication versus something like claims or forms authentication on the target? Are the source users in a different format? Do you have domain / first name dot last name on the source and then first initial dot full last name at domain2.com on the target? Sometimes things are consistent in the username formatting, sometimes they're not. And if they are consistent, usually the tool is able to kind of auto map and figure it out. But that's often not the case. So when things are disparate between source and targets, the Essentials migration tool needs to know specifically which user is on the source should match to which one on the target. Now it's important to note, as we'll get into later, that the migration tool cannot create new users on a target platform. We can only map to existing ones for the simple reason that we don't have the required access to the Active Directory. The second one, of course, is if you have usernames in SharePoint belonging to, say, a document. You have a username belonging to a document as part of the modified by field or the created by field, and that user was just a temporary contractor, hasn't been with the company for 2 years, no longer exists anywhere in Active Directory, doesn't have a valid email address for that company. Who do you map that user to? Because that user also does not have a username on the target. Why? Because they're not around anymore. And there's measures like that you can take, as we'll discuss later. So if you don't have user mappings, you will get invalid usernames. You will get things like a valid username on the source, then you migrate that content, and on the target you look, what does that user have for the metadata? It has things like the system account or your migration account, or perhaps it's even blank in some cases. So for these reasons, we may need to specifically set username mappings and group mappings as well. And there's a couple ways we do that, primarily using a user mappings file, which we will get into more. But that is a brief intro with why you use user mappings and what happens if we don't use them. And now I will hand it over to San here, who will talk a little bit about what areas are specifically affected.
Thanks, Theo. So I'm going to discuss where user mapping is applicable. User mapping is applicable anytime you're doing a migration. That could be simple migration as an item, a list, sites or subsites. There's also many different type of authentication type. Some examples are the domain, claims, NTLM, forms, etc. Those are just a few. User mapping could also be applicable when you want to preserve the created and modified by of a content. So one caveat to remember is when using user mapping, the migration account has to have site collection admin privileges. If you're connecting to the tool with anything other than that, as far as an account that has contribute or read only, that will not suffice because those accounts do not have permission to make changes to users' permission. So if those accounts do not have privileges to make changes to user permission in SharePoint, the tool cannot make those changes. So just want to make sure that when connecting to the tool that you do use site collection admin account. Deal?
Son, user and group mapping. As I briefly alluded to earlier, manual mappings, and we are talking in this presentation about specifically manual mappings, instances where you need to actually tell the tool what we need to map the source user to the target user to, because otherwise the tool won't know. And this scenario applies often to users and groups. When I say groups, I'm speaking specifically about SharePoint groups, but also AD groups. Sometimes you have AD groups nested within SharePoint groups with their own Active Directory objects. And in this case, we'll simply tell the tool in the user mapping file which source user belongs to which target user, which source group belongs to which target group, etc., etc. Orphan users and groups are, as we mentioned, when a user is no longer around. They've left the company, they've been let go, they were only a temp, they're just there for testing purposes, and then their accounts are still in SharePoint, but their accounts are not in Active Directory. But you still want to preserve those. And I'd say from experience in cases, it's about half and half. I'd say maybe half the companies do want to preserve their users. The other half are fine with just defaulting to a default user account, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and I'll show you in the tool here. Or just maybe the system count or the migration count. But in certain cases where there's strict auditing requirements, you may absolutely have no choice but to preserve that original user, even though that user hasn't been with the company for 5 years. So that is something we will also do in the tool. So very quickly, I will just show you here where that's located, referring to the default user account. Now, the way the default user account works, as I just mentioned, basically tells essentials. If you cannot find a target user for the source user, and if we do not have a valid mapping for it, and if you can't auto map it, use this thing called a default user account. If you have your essentials console here, you go to the help tab at the top, you click on profile manager, and then in global variables here, right at the top is this default user account. I don't have one here. Now, because I don't have one here, as I mentioned, what the tool will do is it will just default to the system account, the SharePoint system account, or the migration account. The migration account meaning the account you use to connect to your source and SharePoint targets. But if I don't want to use that, if I want to, I can call this user whatever I want, as long as this user already exists in the target environment. Very important. We cannot create this user. So what some people do is they will create a default user on the target AD, and they'll call it something like previously deleted user or something like that. But that's entirely up to you. So you have to put the username in here in the exact, if you're going to SPO, you would just do your user at, say, domain.com as a typical. And that's what will show up in all your metadata. Son?
Okay, so some troubleshooting steps I'm going to discuss a little bit here. One thing we want to look at is to make sure to check the user mapping file. We want to make sure that the formatting is correct. If it's not correct, then the tool will not be able to perform user mapping. Other places we could look into is make sure files are not checked out. Files need to be checked in before doing any migrations. And it's also important and sometimes overlooked is make sure that user account exists in both environments. So if they don't exist, then the tool will not be able to map them. We could also look into the logs. The logs are very useful because they provide explanation on why users did not get mapped. It could be that the user does not exist in either the source or target, or the users was just skipped.
Okay, thanks, Son. Just going to very briefly show you how to create a mapping file here. Remember, the mapping file is how you specifically tell essentials what source to migrate to what target user. Whether that's for valid users, whether that's for users no longer around, whether that's users who you want to change. And it's absolutely required if there's any kind of difference in your source versus your target users. Now, most companies typically have a naming convention for their usernames. It might be domain / first name dot full last name. However, that's often the case in 90% of the usernames. The other 10% have something completely different, or they didn't follow those guidelines. And unless you have a specific user mapping for those disparate users, they will not show up on the target. So how do we do that? We create a user mappings file. Now, the way we do that, there's a couple steps involved. First step is you have to create a user's report from both your source and target. So you have your source connection and your target connection in the Essentials tool. You right-click on your source, your source connection here, reports, site users. I'm not going to run it because it's going to take several minutes to populate, but I have one saved that I'll show you, site users. It'll create as a CSV. As soon as that's created, you go to your target. Reports, same thing, site users. Click on it, it will generate a CSV file. The way that CSV file looks, it'll just show you the friendly names and the domain names. And the target one is the same. First column is your friendly names. The second column is, in this case, the SPO names, the actual ones that SharePoint uses. So what you have to do to create, now these are not your user mapping file. These are simply an export of your source users and an export of your target users. You have to take the column from your source users, here, column B, copy all that, and make that column A into your new user mapping file, which is a new CSV file here in Excel. Then you will take the exact column in your target, export this column here, and create that, do a side by side. So it might look something like this. Now, this is not side by side because each line has to correspond, so you have to make these match up identically. But this is how your user mapping will look. You have your source user on the left, target user on the right. That's it. It's very simple. Map this user to this user, or map this group to the group right next to it. They have to line up identically. And once that is done, you save it as a CSV, you now have your user mapping file, and you go back into your Essentials tool. Once you bring up your paste options here, you go to your advanced options, remap users. Click load, choose a CSV, open, I'm not going to save it, but then it'll be saved in there, and then you can run your migration job. That's a very brief overview of the user mapping file. It's very important that it be done right, because otherwise we will not be able to map correctly. So very briefly again: 1, export your source users. 2, export your target users. 3, take each of those users and put them into a new user mapping CSV file, side by side, lined up. And then the last step is to simply, when you run your migration job, to click on the remap option in the advanced options and upload your CSV file and run your migration. Then when you run your migration, all the users you have set up in the mappings will now show up in your metadata. You can also map multiple user groups, and Sun's going to show us how to do that. Sun?
Okay, so example where we would want to map multiple users or group is, for example, if your company has 10,000 users, it would be very difficult to map those users manually one by one. So what you could do is use something called a wildcard. And what that is, in the example on the slide, is if you're mapping from, per se, 2013 to SPO, you want to keep your formatting as close as possible. So it would be domain / say first name dot last name. You want to make sure that your target environment in SPO is also claims first name dot last name at thecompany.com. So you want to make sure the formatting is the same. If it's not the same, then that account will not be mapped. So what you want to do is, when you have that set up, put a little asterisk where you put the name at. On the very last line, you can see where it says domain / asterisk. And for the claims, you would do the same. It would be the claims formatting, and then you put the asterisk, and it would map those two users.